Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to paint this beautiful Amaryllis. It's actually sitting on the corner of my desk and I wanted to paint it or sketch it before it went by. I don't know how long I have with these blooms. They just popped and I wanted to make sure I didn't miss out on the opportunity to sketch a beautiful flower from life in the dead of winter. I'm using my Arteza real brush pens, and these are just watercolor filled markers to do my basic sketch. You could use any water-based marker you want. I do like the real brush types of pens because they have the flexible tips and I find it very pleasing to sketch with, but if you don't want to use these or you don't like them or you don't have them, just use a pencil. That's just fine. Oh, and I'll have the real-time tutorial for this lesson in Critique Club, so if you're a Critique Club member, it will be in the February section on February 1st, so you can check that out. If you don't know what Critique Club is and you'd like to check it out, I will have information linked down below and I'll talk a little bit about it later. So basically, as I am sketching here, I am just putting in foundational shapes like circles to help me place the blooms. Now this plant has 4 blooms and they are they almost remind me of like speakers, and like, you know, if you ever see those old like World War II movies, you see those speakers with the horns coming off on each direction at like base camps and stuff. Well, that's what that reminds me of. And you really only see 2 of the blooms, and none of them are dead on because I didn't want to just have one dead on flower and then just bits of other ones. So I have 2 3/4 view flowers, and then we just see peaks of the other ones in behind. And I just used 3 colors of real brush pen. Now I'm working in my sketchbook, which is a Fabriano Venice book, and by adding water to the marker, it doesn't blend a whole heck of a lot. On watercolor paper or Bristol board, it would blend a lot more, but I really enjoyed the sketchbook and I wanted to work in it. And plus I knew I was going to go over with gouache and it wouldn't give me any problems in the future. I'm using some Zen mixed media brushes. These are by Royal and Langnickel and they're very affordable, and I think most of your big box stores will carry them, or they have like sets on Amazon, so they're pretty easy to find, and you know, they're probably around, I would say if you're buying them individually, about $4 a brush. And I am using a couple shades of red. I'm using this kind of orangey red that I would call like a probably like a scarlet or a vermilion red. It's kind of orangey, and I'm also using a crimson red, and I'm putting the crimson more in the shadows and the scarlet more in the highlights. And I've taken a little bit of phthalo blue and I've added it to the crimson to make this really kind of deep eggplant color, because it's just right for the shadows in the inner part of the trumpet of these flowers. Since these are red can be kind of difficult to deal with because it's such a strong, overpowering color. Red is my favorite color, but I don't wear it on camera very often because it is such a difficult color to photograph and a difficult color to work with when you're painting. But I think it's good to take those difficult colors and, you know, see what you can do with it. See what kind of shadows and highlights that you can find. And I think part of it is that, you know, when you're highlighting red, well, if you use white, you're going to have pink. If you use yellow, you're going to end up with orange. So you've got to kind of balance it. A lot of times you have to use white mixed with yellow to get a nice highlight on red. So we'll get to the highlights later on. When I'm using gouache, I like to get the darker and midtones in first and save those highlights to the end, because white can really overpower gouache. It's the same like with oil paints or pastel, that white is so opaque and so strong that it kind of bullies all the other colors. So I kind of hold off before I use too much white. Now I am adding some of that deeper red that I mixed with the phthalo blue in those blooms that are in back to kind of push them back, because you cool down the temperature of something and you push it back, and that's what I was doing there. This is all pretty much just base coating everything and just assigning values to things. I switched to a round brush here to get the little petals. There's kind of a couple little spiky, I don't know what they are. They're like a little spiky leaf, kind of. There's like a couple skinny ones and then there's a thicker one. And I just painted those in with a lighter version, adding a little yellow to that, a little more yellow to the yellow phthalo green mix. I got some reflections there on that green, so I know it's hard to see what I mixed up there, but you could probably tell by the paper. Now I'm drying this because I want to be able to layer on top, and if I don't dry it, what's going to happen is when I go with the next layer, it's going to pick up the color underneath and give me some issues. And also with this being nice and dry, I can go back in with my real brush pens and I can add some defining lines wherever I need to. So it's just a little easier to draw those little fine lines with a marker like this. than trying to do it with a paintbrush. I typically like flats and filberts when I'm working with gouache because it's a little heavier bodied than watercolor, which I prefer to use a round. If I use a round, I end up picking up so much water that it makes the gouache more like watercolor. So that's why I prefer to use a flat and filberts. And I like the golden Taklon brushes or nylon brushes for this because they just have a little bit more spring to them and can handle the heavier paint. So I've added some white into that light lime green color that I mixed with I used a warm yellow. All the yellow I'm using is like a gamboge or a cad yellow deep. It's a warm, really warm yellow. And I'm just adding a little white to that to get some highlights and to give the stock a little bit more body, because that stock has to hold up those 4 flowers. It has to be really rugged. So I just want to make sure that that stock feels sturdy enough to hold up those plants. And that's another reason I wanted to paint this flower, because the flowers would kind of lean towards like in different directions in my living room. And I was just worried that it was I was going to wake up one morning and it would be completely tipped over. So I'm not sure if I should stake it or not, because it's back up straight again. It kind of moves a bit. It's kind of freaky. And I did water it once. I was afraid of overwatering it. Plants give me anxiety. I just got to paint it before it dies. But hopefully it'll stay bloomed for a while because they're so pretty. You can add a little yellow to give a little richness and life to the stock. And just keep mixing from those same few colors. We've used 2 reds, we've used like a vermilion, we've used a crimson, we've used a phthalo blue, we've used a gamboge yellow, and we've used white very sparingly. But that's really all you need for this. And I will list those colors in the video description. Now, what I used for, obviously that dark mix is not black. What I used was the scarlet red, the one that's a little orangey or vermilion. I can't remember what Arteza calls it, because I do have it is the Arteza gouache, but I squirted it all into a fish and tackle box. That mixed with a phthalo blue gives you a really nice black without using black, because that can look really unnatural. So if you keep mixing from those 5 colors, you're going to get a much more harmonious relationship between all of your subjects. You're not going to have like this discordant feeling or awkward feeling or thinking, what, something's wrong with this, but I can't put my finger on it, or that kind of little bit of amateurish look. A lot of times that comes from using every color in the box all at once. Now, I love having lots of colors, but I don't use them all at once. You want to stick to a few colors per painting, so you end up having that harmony, I think anyways, unless you're going for a different sort of energy in your work. Now, I decided here I wanted these petals to be a little bit longer. They felt a little too compact. Now, in Amaryllis, say, versus like a tiger lily or something, they're that same trumpet shape of flower, but the blossoms or the petals on the Amaryllis are very packed together. So look at, if you think of flower blooms that have that trumpet shape, a lily is a very common one, but also gladiolas. Each little blossom on a gladiola will also have that shape, but a gladiola looks completely different because the petals are so wide and close together. The amaryllis is like kind of in between what a gladiola looks like and what a lily looks like. There's 6 petals that come from a trumpet shaped collar, but they're pretty packed together, so you're only going to see like little triangle wedges between the leaves just at the ends, and not very steep ones. Whereas if you had like a tiger lily, you would have big, like, acute angles between the petals. I hope that makes sense. So it's just, if you learn how to draw basic flower shapes, you're going to be able to adapt it to different flowers because they all kind of come from like the same 5 shapes. So it's really useful to know that. In my course, Watercolor Flower Workshop, I do go into the basic shapes of the flowers and how to render them. But it's a very loose style workshop, so if you're not into loose style paintings, you might not care for that so much. So I just wanted to warn you there. But it does go into those principles. It's one of those things where the more you observe and the more you learn, the more you can apply that to other things, and it can really help. Now here I am going in with some highlighting, and I've used white, but the white on its own looked too stark and too cool, so I did add a little bit of yellow into that to warm it up a bit. Because this is a funny thing. The texture of an object can also determine how warm or cool the light looks as it hits it for a highlight. So I have natural daylight bulbs on this plant, and I have a window nearby, so I have it's all daylight, like daylight bulbs. It's all daylight balanced. So generally, if you have daylight light bouncing off of something, it's going to give you a cool reflection, because daylight lamps and the sunlight is actually cool in temperature, whereas like a incandescent bulb is very warm in texture. But the texture of these petals are this kind of like velvety, almost like a flocking, and that must scatter the light somehow because the highlights look warm. So, and the highlights on the stalk look cool because of the smooth, hard texture, or just like kind of the smooth, waxy texture of the stalk. So by having white in there, it just looks way too cool. It looks like the color temperature's off because of how strong red is. And I think it's another reason why red is so difficult to work with. It wants to, that and the texture of the flower wants to adjust the color temperature of what you're working on. So it's just a little confusing there. I'm doing this flower the same way I did the other one, starting in first with my shadows. Remember, when you're working with an opaque media like gouache, oils, or pastels, if you go in with your darks first, you're going to avoid mud. And in watercolor, I like to go in with my darks first just to assign values. So I find that, probably because I work with so many different medias, I find that to be a little bit more, it's more serving to the way that I paint. But you can see how instead of it being a red blob, now we've actually got some shape and form. And that happens when you go in with your darks first. If you find when you look at your watercolor paintings that everything feels like it's mid-range, consider going in with darks first. Now I've switched to a filbert brush and the kind of orangey red, so I took that like vermilion color, that scarlety vermilion with a little bit of the warm yellow, and I'm going in and adding it to any place I want to be my highlight areas. Now this isn't the high highlights, but it's just getting in that highlight area. And now I'm going back in with a little bit more yellow, and I am putting in the brighter highlights over that using a small round brush. This is a number 2. So you know, vary your brush depending on the size of the stroke that you want to make. I typically don't go too tiny with my brushes, even in this, I think this is about a 6" by 9" sketchbook. But if you're working larger, you know, you probably don't even want to go this small. So use whatever is comfortable for you. There's no rule. If you're painting like in a botanical style, you probably want teeny tiny little brushes. And if you're trying to get a more looser style, go with a bigger brush. That's probably the number 1 technique to loosen up, would be try a larger brush, and try a more absorbent brush if you're using watercolor. But that will help loosen you up, just because you can't fuss around with tiny details. And that's probably the thing I get asked the most from students is, how do I loosen up? And I feel that to mean they want to stop fussing, they want to enjoy it more, and they want to stop kind of festering in the details. So bigger brush, it'll really help. Bigger brush and maybe a timer, and don't let yourself work on something for more than a certain amount of time. So now I'm going in here again with the white, and as you can see, look how cool that looks. It looks wrong, doesn't it? We're going to go over that in a few minutes with a little bit of yellow to kind of temper it a little bit, but I wanted to kind of carve out those brighter spots first. So occasionally I'll go in with white. Also, because it's gouache, it's, you know, it's like, it's an opaque watercolor. It'll pick up what's underneath if I want to work it back and forth a little bit. So knowing that it may pick up what's underneath, sometimes I'll go in with just with white, even though I know I don't want just bright white, but the fact that it'll pick up what's underneath, I know that it's going to cross-pollinate a little bit. I can always go back in with a little yellow later. And here I'm using that same dark mix. Remember, that was the phthalo blue plus the like scarlety color. And I added some shadows to push that bloom back further and give it a little form. Now I'm going in with white for some highlights, and that's going to help bring a little life and finishing look to the elements here. And I like to jump around. That's another thing that I do a lot. I did that one flower on its own because in Critique Club I am showing like the step-by-step process on that flower. But generally I jump around from piece to piece because I don't want to end up with one section of my painting looking beautiful and then realize that it's completely out of scale or out of proportion or just doesn't relate at all to the rest of the drawing. And if you kind of jump around and you work on everything at once, then the likelihood of that happening is very small. So kind of keep that in mind. That's another loosening up thing. You can be accurate and still have a loose painting. And I think sometimes people will call loose sloppy. Loose doesn't have to be sloppy. Loose is kind of like if you think of an economy of brush strokes, like maybe think of it as you're getting charged $5 a brush stroke, so you want to use only what you absolutely need to use. So use an economy of brush strokes. That will help you loosen up, and you can still be accurate, and you probably be more accurate because you know that every stroke is going to matter, and it will make you less likely to fuss around with all the details. Although fussing around, if you're really enjoying your painting, can be a wonderful thing. Something I don't do very often, but I'm really enjoying with this picture, is keeping the background white. Even though I made a little splotch outside of the flower on the left, I'm going to turn that into something, so it'll be fine. I'm really enjoying that crisp red flower on that crisp white background. So that's something, you know, if you don't typically do that, give it a try. Or if you always paint on a white background, try using a background. It's you can do some really neat things. In fact, this would be kind of fun to do, like if you like collaged like some mulberry paper or some pattern tissue paper or something. I think it would be really fun to use the markers and the gouache over that. The markers would feather on the mulberry paper, but the gouache wouldn't too badly. It would only feather if you used a ton of water. There you can have a glimpse of my my palette. This is another thing I want to mention to you. I'm doing the stamens, and I'm kind of putting it on kind of thick, right? But it's not really thick. It's not textural. If I was to wipe my hand, like after it dried, if I was to run my hand across the paper, I wouldn't feel really big bumps and valleys. Because if you see my palette there, see how all those paints, they look like they've been almost like rocks in there? That's because when you dry gouache, and a pellet, it crackles, right? It cracks and it can break apart. You can add some glycerin into it to help prevent that, but I just make sure I have a high wall palette and it's fine. Well, that's the same reason you don't want to have it too thick on your paper, because if you have it thick on your paper and your paper bends, the paint could pop off, and you don't want that. You don't want that in your sketchbook. Your sketchbook is meant to be able to be flipped around, and even on paper that you were going to frame and put in a frame under glass, you still wouldn't want that because it could still crack. And a word of caution on gouache, this gouache does have light fastness ratings on it, but I wouldn't necessarily trust gouache to be light fast unless it's from like probably Mgram or Schminke or one of the bigger known companies that does pretty extensive light fast tests, because it can fade. So this is definitely a perfect sketchbook medium. And I just wanted to put that out there in case, you painted your masterpiece. Make sure you use like a UV glass and you protect it maybe with some UV spray to keep it safe. I think my painting would have been fine to leave it just as gouache, but honestly, I was having so much fun painting this, and I didn't know how much longer my plant, would be all bloomed. So I decided I would play with some colored pencils. Here I'm using some neons, and like I just mentioned with light fastness, neon colors of anything are fugitive. But since this is going to be in my sketchbook, I'm playing with neons. I like to glaze neons over gouache and over other things just because it really just makes a color glow. I'll still have those beautiful colors underneath. Even if the neon faded, I would still have a beautiful painting under there, but I just really wanted that richness. I feel like it can kind of help bring out that velvety quality and help show the brightness of the petals without changing the hue of what I have there too much. I'm using this beautiful Tuscan red for my shadows. It's a great color, especially like when you want to deepen something and not use black. I like to use Tuscan red and indigo. I didn't use indigo with this, but if I really want a black, I'll use indigo with it. And it's just such a nice natural look for those times where you want an almost black, but you don't want to use black because you feel it's going to be too unnatural looking. This color here is Chartreuse, another one of my favorites. Don't mind how grungy the barrel looks. I had dropped it and it shattered the core, and I microwaved it for 10 seconds and brought it back to life. But it did damage the paint on the barrel, but it still works good, so I don't care. If you do that, just make sure you stay with your microwave, you watch it, and I can't guarantee results, but it's worked for me anytime I've tried it. That's all I can say. I'm putting in some highlights with a white pencil, and I may need to go over this white a little bit because I find the Prismacolor white to be a little bit cool, like cool in temperature. So here I noticed that if I put it down and I go over it with a red, I get a gorgeous just gorgeous glaze. It works really well to get those highlights in the trumpet area of the flowers, and I'm scumbling on a little bit of this golden yellow orangey color. It's kind of, I think it's called yellowed orange, just to bring up the richness of the petals a little bit. Now that pretty much does it. You can add as much or as little as you want to, but I really enjoyed this and I'm happy with how it turned out. I'm going to share some still shots of this, and if you're interested in a real-time version of this tutorial, it is in, or it will be up in February 1st in Critique Club, which is a membership club I have over in my Teachable school. It's a place for you to share the current painting you're working on each month and get feedback and advice and help along the way. Plus 2 real-time tutorials that are pulled from my Sketchbook Sunday videos. If that's something that would be useful for you, click on the link below and check it out. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy crafting!